Good evening and welcome to Gravitas. I'm Palki Sharma Upadhyay. Let's get started.
О признании Донецкой Народной Республики.
Three months of troop build-up and finally Vladimir Putin fired the first shot. He divided Ukraine. He declared two parts of the country as independent republics, Donetsk and Luhansk. Then he sent troops and tanks to the region. He said they were peacekeepers. America has dismissed this as quote-unquote nonsense and imposed sanctions on the region. The UK too has announced sanctions. Germany has cancelled the $11 billion Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline with Russia. Global markets have tanked. Oil prices shot up. Condemnations to statements, charges and countercharges have been flowing through the day. Is this a Russian invasion? Is this a repeat of 2014 when Crimea was annexed by Russia? Is this war? How will Ukraine respond? What are its options? Have Western threats and sanctions failed again? Why is Vladimir Putin doing what he is and at what cost? And where does India stand on this? On Gravitas tonight, we'll bring you the most definitive analysis on the biggest international story. We begin with Gravitas Global Headlines.
German Chancellor Olaf Scholz halts the certification of the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline designed to bring Russian gas to Germany. This after Russia formally recognized two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine, leading to a rise in tensions in the Ukraine conflict. Around 60 people were killed and dozens wounded in an explosion at an informal gold mining site in southwest Burkina Faso. The cause of the explosion in the Pony province is unclear as of now. Sri Lanka's inflation hits a record high for the fourth consecutive month as an economic crisis driven by a crippling foreign exchange shortage worsens. The island nation's energy minister warns about a looming fuel shortage. In New Zealand, the riot police clashes with anti-vax protesters outside the country's parliament. Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern expresses concern over extremely violent clashes as one protester drove a car towards the police line, narrowly avoiding officers. In a landmark ruling, judges on Colombia's constitutional court vote to decriminalize abortion until 24 weeks of pregnancy, marking a major victory for the nation's feminist movements. Tonga reconnects to the world after a crucial submarine cable was repaired, a month after a volcanic eruption and tsunami cut off communication lines to the remote Pacific island nation. Italy's Mount Etna roars back in action. Massive plumes of ash steam spotted over Sicily from a southeast crater of Europe's tallest and most active volcano. The volcanic activity shut down the nearby Catania airport. A fossil jawbone found on Scotland's Isle of Skye has led scientists to discover the skeleton of a pterosaur, which is the biggest fossil of its kind. It lived roughly 170 million years ago during the Jurassic period and may have had a wingspan of more than 2.5 meters. The United States women's national soccer team and governing body U.S. Soccer have reached an agreement over the dispute over equal pay. The agreement will see the USWNT get a total of $24 million, and going forward, the women's and men's national teams will receive an equal rate of pay in all friendlies and tournaments, including the World Cup. World number 3 Alexander Zverev beat American Jenson Brooksby at the Mexican Open in the latest ever finish to a professional tennis match. The defending champion saved 2 match points before completing a 3-6, 7-6, 6-2 win at 4:54 a.m. local time in Acapulco. The previous latest finish was 4:34 a.m. when Leighton Hewitt beat Marcos Baghdatis at the 2008 Australian Open.
Vladimir Putin has done it again. He sliced Ukraine once in 2014, and on Monday he did it again. Putin has recognized 2 breakaway republics in Ukraine's east. They're called Donetsk and Luhansk. As always, it wasn't just about the policy, it was about how the policy was announced. Yesterday evening, President Putin sprung a surprise. He said he would deliver a prime-time address to his people. Clearly something big was on the cards. But how big? Well, that was the question. What we got was 57 minutes of Vladimir Putin uncensored, his endless complaints against the West, his warped interpretation of history, his dreams of rebuilding the Russian Empire. Social media had no idea how to interpret it. Was Putin delusional? Or was he declaring war? Either way, the speech made one thing very clear. Putin is not bluffing. He will not let Ukraine join the NATO, and for that he will use any excuse, even nuclear weapons.
We also know there were already statements voiced about Ukraine aiming to produce its own nuclear weapons. And it's not just empty bravado. Ukraine indeed possesses Soviet technologies and the means for producing such weapons.
Do you see what Putin is doing? He's flipping the narrative. The West says Russia is threatening Ukraine, but Putin says we are not the threat. We are the victims. NATO promised not to expand eastward after the Cold War, but the same NATO is breaking that promise.
Fine, you don't want to see a friend and an ally in us, but why turn us into an enemy? There's only one answer. It's not about our political regime or something else. They just don't need a country that is as large and independent as Russia. That is the answer to all the questions. That is the source of traditional American politics on the Russian front.
Putin is right on one thing. NATO's obsession with expansion is fueling this fire. Having said that, his own policies are even more problematic. For starters, Vladimir Putin does not think Ukraine is a real country. He says Vladimir Lenin created Ukraine. Its history, its culture, its people, everything is linked to Russia. Well, it is a good piece of propaganda, but like most propaganda, it is not true. Ukraine does have a distinct history, and that history is centuries old. What Ukraine got from Russia, from the Soviet Union rather, was pain and hardships, biblical famines, ethnic cleansing, ruthless purges by Stalin. But rewriting Ukraine's history is beneficial for Putin. A, it justifies the independence of Donbas republics, and B, it gives him permission to send soldiers into the region, and that's exactly what the Russian president did. First, he signed a treaty of friendship with Donetsk and Luhansk, and then within hours, he deployed troops. And just to be clear, Russian soldiers were already deployed there. But yesterday, it was made official. So what are the big takeaways from Putin's Manic Monday speech? Takeaway number 1. He's got a measure of the Western response. Germany, for instance, has halted Nord Stream 2. Now, this is big. Nord Stream 2 is NATO's biggest bargaining tool against Russia. So far, Berlin was reluctant to leverage it. But Putin's decision on Monday seems to have made up Olaf Scholz's mind. Takeaway number 2. He's got a staging ground. Russian equipment has already reached Donbas. From there, they can push further inland. So you've got 3 robust bases to attack. You have Belarus in the north, Crimea in the south, and Donbas in the east. Takeaway number 3. He has buried the long-dead Minsk agreement. To be fair, it was a failed ceasefire. President Zelensky of Ukraine hated it. President Putin of Russia ignored it. And Monday was its official funeral. Takeaway number 4. Putin's endgame has been revealed. He knows NATO will not back down. He knows there will be sanctions. So Putin's strategy is a lose-lose situation. If he cannot have Ukraine, nobody can. By recognizing the rebel republics, Putin has sealed Ukraine's fate. More insurgency, more infighting, more bloodshed, not the kind of country that NATO will recruit. Takeaway number 5, a face saver for Vladimir Putin. An invasion was always going to be costly. Thousands of lives lost, millions of dollars spent. This is a much safer strategy. Putin can train and fund the rebels openly. Basically all the violence, but none of the responsibility.
As for those who have seized power in Kiev and are holding on to it, we demand that they stop military operations immediately. Otherwise, all responsibility for the possible continuation of bloodshed will be fully on the conscience of the regime in power in Kiev.
What will worry Putin is Europe's response. Washington has only sanctioned Donetsk and Luhansk, basically rebel leaders. Just one problem though, these rebels do not have yachts in the Mediterranean or Swiss bank accounts. So American sanctions are toothless. Europe though has sprung a surprise. Germany, like we told you, halted Nord Stream 2. Britain is warning of concrete sanctions. Putin may have expected a pushback, but it's coming from the wrong place. Brussels, not Washington. What happens next depends on Ukraine's reaction. In 2014, they could not react. They criticized, they condemned. But remember, Russia still controls Crimea, 8 years on. And this time around, Ukraine is much stronger, something President Zelensky did point out.
We are on our land. We are not afraid of anybody and anything. We owe nothing to anybody. And we will not give anything to anyone. And we are confident about it, because today is not February 2014, but February 2022. It is a different country with a different army, but the same goal, the peace in Ukraine.
Peace in Ukraine. Well, that depends on Vladimir Putin. He's got the staging ground, he's got local support, and he's got an excuse for invading.
It's incredibly serious what's happening in Ukraine.
We will immediately institute a package of economic sanctions.
Tomorrow, the United States will impose sanctions on Russia for this clear violation of international law.
우크라이나의 주권과 영토 보존은 존중되어야 합니다.
이번의 러시아의行為は 国際法違反であります.
Russia should step back. It should unconditionally withdraw.
The Secretary General is greatly concerned by the decision by the Russian Federation related to the status of certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions of Ukraine.
Step back, withdraw your troops, respect Ukraine's sovereignty, or face severe economic sanctions. This, by and large, is the world's message to Russia. Moscow's actions have divided the world into three clear paths. One side supports Ukraine and slams Russia. The second side supports Russia and slams the West. And the third does not want to pick a side. The most vocal reactions were from Kiev's Western allies. They said Russia has violated Ukraine's territorial integrity. Then we have Russian allies and former Soviet republics. They say the West left Moscow with no choice and that Putin's declaration was long overdue. Also reacting with the global markets. Oil prices surged, stock markets tanked before recovering a bit. Where is all of this headed? In the next few minutes, we'll bring you the global response and plan of action, if there is one. Starting with the condemnation. Ukraine's allies are furious. They're threatening a retaliation. The US ambassador to the United Nations said Putin sending so-called peacekeepers to Donbas is quote-unquote nonsense.
Tomorrow, the United States will impose sanctions on Russia for this clear violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We can, will, and must stand united in our calls for Russia to withdraw its forces, return to the diplomatic table, and work toward peace. Thank you.
The US is imposing sanctions. So is the United Kingdom. Prime Minister Boris Johnson says he will immediately institute a package of economic sanctions that will apparently hit Russia very hard. Exact words spoken.
We will immediately institute a package of economic sanctions, which I think, as people would expect, targeted not just at entities in Donbas, in Lugansk and Donetsk, but in Russia itself, targeting Russian economic interests as hard as we can, and they will hit Russia very hard. And there is a lot more that we are going to do in the event of an invasion.
France, meanwhile, is still pressing for a diplomatic settlement. It has not ruled out the possibility of sanctions, though. This is what they said.
In the coming days, we will examine an exchange with my European finance counterparts on how to protect European economies and the French economy in the face of the consequences of the escalation in the Ukraine situation. We are currently studying different decisions that can be taken.
Germany has gone a step ahead. Sanctions plus the suspension of Nord Stream 2. It's the $11 billion gas pipeline between Russia and Germany. Also a major point of contention, remember. The US says this pipeline increases European dependence on Russia. Now Germany has put it on hold. This is what Chancellor Olaf Scholz said.
This may sound technical, but it's a necessary step under the administrative law so that no certification of the pipeline can now take place. And without this certification, Nord Stream 2 cannot go into operation.
These are the NATO member states, all talking about sanctions. What about the rest of the world? So far, only 3 countries have taken a clear stand: South Korea, Japan and Australia. All 3 American allies, all backing sanctions. At the same time, also advocating dialogue.
Sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine must be respected. We must actively seek a peaceful solution through dialogue.
With regards to this situation, our country has grave concerns and will monitor carefully. We will coordinate and work with the G7 and the international community to respond, including sanctions.
The moment that other countries put in place strong and severe sanctions on Russia, we will be in lockstep with them and we'll be moving just as quickly. And that's what their discussions that we've been engaged with now for some time with our partners.
This was the pro-Ukraine camp. Now let's talk about Russian allies. The Serbian president, for one, has refused to side with NATO. He says it's a difficult situation, that on the one hand, he supports the integrity of Ukraine, but he cannot ignore the fact that 85% of Ukrainians will be on Russia's side. We do not know where he got that figure, but this is what he said. Daniel Ortega, the president of Nicaragua, says he's facing a similar dilemma. He favors Russia's decision to integrate Donetsk and Luhansk, and that if a referendum were to be held there, most people, in his opinion, would vote in favor of Russia. Then we have China, one of Russia's closest allies. The US Secretary of State said he'd spoken to the Chinese leadership to secure the sovereignty of Ukraine. Well, you heard that right. America is listing China's help to secure the sovereignty of a country. Not surprisingly, the Chinese ambassador at the United Nations Security Council did not criticize Russia. He said the current situation is, and I'm quoting, a result of many complex factors.
The current situation in Ukraine is a result of many complex factors. China always makes its own position according to the merits of the matter itself. We believe that all countries should solve international disputes by peaceful means in line with the purposes and principles of the UN Charter.
Meanwhile, the global markets were a sea of red. Especially hit was Europe. London's benchmark index shed 1.2% to over 7,000 points. In the Eurozone, Frankfurt's DAX fell 2% and the Paris CAC also retreated 1.8%. In India, Sensex fell more than 380 points. The Nifty shed 114 points, as did several other sectoral indices. Oil prices have also been hit. On Tuesday morning, the price of Brent crude reached $99 per barrel, the highest mark since September 2014. The spike has primarily been driven by fears of a supply chain disruption. So we've told you what Putin said and did. We've told you how the world responded. Now let's talk about why Putin did what he did. what is inside the mind of Vladimir Putin. Look at his past. Look at what shaped him. Your first job leaves a huge impression on you. Your character, your method of working, a lot is molded by your first job and it stays with you. And for Vladimir Putin, that's espionage. He worked as a KGB spy for nearly 16 years, from 1975 to 1991. Back then, spy work was not exactly like James Bond. No flying cars, no cutting-edge technology. You had to rely on your wits. Vladimir Putin honed his craft during this time. At the height of the Cold War, one particular story stands out from his career. The year is 1989. The Berlin Wall has fallen. A group of protesters is charging to the KGB headquarters in Dresden. Suddenly, an agent comes out to confront them. Agent Vladimir Putin. What does he have to say? That his comrades inside the building are armed and dangerous. And if they force through, there will be bloodshed. That's what he told the protesters. And hearing this, the protesters leave. Now for the grand twist. There were no armed comrades inside. Vladimir Putin was bluffing. And it worked. Such stories are part of the Putin legend. You see him riding horses shirtless. You see him taking a dip in icy cold waters. You see him driving Formula One cars. It is all part of brand building. Putin, the tough yet enigmatic statesman. So far, this brand has worked for him. Vladimir Putin has dealt with 5 US presidents. Each president thought they understood the Russian leader. Listen to this.
I looked the man in the eye. I found it to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul. He's a man deeply committed to his country and the best interests of his country.
You know Vladimir Putin. You think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm. I do.
So what price must he pay?
The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see shortly.
How about that? George Bush said he looked into Putin's soul. And what did he see? A straightforward and trustworthy leader. Joe Biden also looked into Putin's soul. But Biden saw a killer, and he said as much. That is the mystery around Putin. The West calls him a maniac, a mercurial leader, but his track record suggests the opposite. A victory in Syria, major influence over Iran and North Korea, backing the winning side in Afghanistan, and winning back influence in Belarus and Kazakhstan. That's an impressive track record. Now compare that to America. Failures in Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. Does that make Putin right? Well, it doesn't, but it does make him successful. Vladimir Putin does have grandiose dreams. He regrets the collapse of the Soviet Union. He mourns the fall of the Russian Empire. If given the chance, he will revive Russia's glory. Just one problem. Putin's grasp exceeds his reach. The Russia of 2022 is a declining power, a failing economy with rampant corruption and a rising China on its periphery. Today's Russia has only one claim to power. It's 6,000 nuclear warheads. Take those away and Russia's finished. So Putin must strike a delicate balance. His dreams of Russian supremacy. Yet he is held back by Russia's reality. So what does he do? Well, he uses his personality to keep the West honest. All the brinkmanship, all the aggression, it's part of a larger strategy. You see, Putin has realized something that America still hasn't. Influence beats intervention. Washington always wants to intervene. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, they call themselves the guardians of democracy. Putin has no such delusion. As they say, foreign policy is domestic policy with a hat. So Putin will back dictators, rebel leaders, extremists, basically anyone who does business with him. It's a dangerous policy, but Putin has made it work so far because of the aura around him. All the stories of espionage, all the macho displays, it makes Vladimir Putin a formidable enemy. But what if you peel away those layers? Who is the real Vladimir Putin? A leader who is still stuck in 1991. Putin called the Soviet collapse the biggest geopolitical catastrophe in the 20th century. Not Hitler's rise, not the world wars. 1991 was Putin's worst dream. And this tells you something about the Russian president. He is designed to distrust the West. He's programmed to bluff. And more importantly, he is a 20th century statesman, not a 21st century diplomat. Putin still believes in balance of power. What do I mean by that? Imagine China or Russia placing missiles in Mexico or Canada. How would Joe Biden react? Would he let that happen? Or would he threaten to respond? Well, that is precisely what Putin is doing. He does not want enemy troops on his doorstep. He does not believe that balance of power is overrated. America does, which is why they were caught off guard in 2014 and again in 2021-22. Vladimir Putin, the maverick, is not a Russian creation. It is a Western narrative. The Russian president merely built on it. When Biden called him a killer, do you remember what Putin said? It takes one to know one. He did not deny it. He played on it. That is Vladimir Putin for you. Delusional, overambitious, risk-taking, but more astute than he lets on. And the decisions Putin takes in a few days will impact not just Ukraine, but also its allies, plus former Soviet republics. Besides Ukraine, there are 5 others in Eastern Europe. What does this crisis mean for them? Will they be caught in another Cold War? Will they be next in line for a takeover? Also, what about the rest of the world? How will this crisis in Ukraine impact you and me? What kind of disruptions should we brace for? Here's a report.
After weeks of dire warnings and attempts to prevent a war, a geopolitical nightmare has come to life. Russia has ordered troops into Ukraine once again. What does it mean for Ukraine? A Russian invasion could upend the lives of its 44 million citizens. Anxiety is coursing through the country. Ukraine is still not a NATO member. So it cannot count on direct military support for now. The Ukrainian armed forces are on their own, and they're no match for the Russian juggernaut. The implications will be beyond the military and security dimensions. The talk of war is already costing Ukraine's economy $3 billion a month. If a war breaks out, experts say the Kyiv economy will be torn to shreds.
I don't like it at all. I think the peace Vladimir Putin or Russia will offer to Donetsk and Luhansk won't be the same as Ukraine could offer. They won't have banks working. It would be like in Crimea, but much worse.
The conflict could spiral out of Ukraine. It could lead to a refugee crisis and destabilize Ukraine's neighbors. Reports suggest Russia could even infiltrate the refugee flows with special operation troops to cause trouble in NATO countries. What does this crisis mean for former Soviet republics being caught in another Cold War? A return to the metaphorical Iron Curtain. Most post-Soviet states like Poland, Georgia, Moldova, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania will be under pressure to take sides. And that's the best-case scenario. The worst is this: these states could be next in line for a Russian invasion. Putin has repeatedly called the breakup of the USSR a historical mistake, and he seems intent on trying to fix it. What does this crisis mean for the rest of the world? More disruptions, market volatility, oil price hikes, more supply chain pain. Russia is a major exporter of rare earth minerals used in airplanes and converters. Ukraine is a major source of neon used in making semiconductors. Both countries also produce major quantities of fertilizers. If a war happens, if Russia is sanctioned, the industries that rely on exports from Russia and Ukraine will have to deal with delays and shortages. It is safe to say what happens in Ukraine will impact all parts of the world.
So Putin has declared the breakaway regions as independent republics. What changes for them? What changes for Donbas? To be honest, not very much. The region always had covert Russian military presence. Putin has only made it official. And he has recognized the rebel leaders. You know which other country has recognized these republics? Syria. No surprises here. Russia has been President Bashar al-Assad's main ally ever since the war broke out in 2011. Now, Donbas has two republics have been declared independent, and Donbas, we know, has been a breakaway region since 2014. Functioning independent of Ukraine since 2014. 2014 was when Russia annexed Crimea. Soon after that, rebel leaders seized territory in Donbas. Parts of Luhansk and Donetsk fell to separatists. They were backed by Russia. Then fighting followed, Ukrainian forces versus the rebels. Then they signed a ceasefire agreement in 2014 and then again in 2015. It's called the Minsk Accord. It failed. It was never implemented. So in a way, Donbas has been at war for 8 years now. At least 14,000 lives have been lost. Not too long ago, we told you what happens in Donbas will determine the course of this conflict. And we were right. Putin has sealed the fate of Ukraine with this decision. He has recognized the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk and sent troops on the pretext of peacekeeping. How do the residents of Donbas see this? Well, most of them are not complaining. There were celebratory fireworks last night. Men and women waved the Russian flag. Take a look.
This is what I will tell my children, which I have plenty. That's why I'm trying to remember this moment. I cannot put all the emotions into words. I'm happy. I'm very happy.
This is another break in the roadway which we have been building since 2014. The roadway to the Russian Federation.
You see, a majority of Donbas residents support Russia. They sympathize with Russia, and the reason goes beyond geographical proximity. The shared blood, shared heritage. Most of these people speak Russian. In the last 8 years, Donbas has been further Russified. For example, the official currency was changed to the Russian ruble. Schools were forced to follow the Russian curriculum. Today, Donetsk even marks Russia Day on the 12th of June. When the Wuhan virus struck, Russia supplied Donbas with aid. It sent Wuhan virus vaccines. While Sputnik 5 was banned in Ukraine, Donbas inoculated its people with the Russian vaccine. Russia's support for this region has not been unconditional, though. Look at where Donbas is positioned on the map. It is strategically important. Extending control over this region gives Moscow the chance to interfere in Ukrainian politics. So when Putin came to power, here's what he did. He began issuing passports to Donbas residents. How many? At least 800,000 passports have been issued till date. 8 lakh. Last week, the Russian parliament wanted to seal this deal. The Duma proposed that Putin should formally recognize the Donbas. And soon Putin said this region was witnessing a genocide. Days of shelling followed, and then Putin made his move. Last night he said the recognition of Donbas was long overdue. And by finally putting ink to paper, Vladimir Putin successfully turned this region into a political theatre. For the Ukrainian-speaking population, the last couple of weeks have been a nightmare. When the shelling spiked, several families began packing their bags and crossing into Ukraine.
After the evacuation, the entire neighborhood moved out. You went out into the street and there were no people there. It was scary.
What people like her are leaving behind is a region that's already devastated by war. Donbas has coal and minerals. Back in the day, it also had industries. The war destroyed them. Now the United States has banned investment in Donbas. It has banned trade with the region. More countries are likely to follow suit. So going forward, Donbas will be completely dependent on Russian patronage. It will become like Abkhazia and South Ossetia. These regions broke away from Georgia, remember? Russia recognized them in 2008. Only 4 other countries did: Syria, Nauru, Venezuela and Nicaragua, all Russian allies. Today, Abkhazia and South Ossetia stand isolated. They're barred from joining international trade regimes or doing formal trade. And this could be the fate of Donbas. Its rebel leaders do not have a plan B, really. Building an army is their top priority. They've called on the youth to join compulsory military service. Each escalation in Ukraine also puts India in a tough spot. Until now, the choice was political. Russia on one side, America on the other. It was all about picking one over the other. But now the situation has changed. It is not a political question anymore, or not just a political question. It is also a question of ideology. Russia has openly violated Ukraine's sovereignty. They are backing violent separatists. Will India condone such behavior or criticize it? Right now, India is somewhere in the middle. At the United Nations Security Council, Indian Ambassador T.S. Tirumurthy called for restraint and dialogue.
The escalation of tension along the border of Ukraine with the Russian Federation is a matter of deep concern. These developments have the potential to undermine peace and security of the region. We call for restraint on all sides. The immediate priority is de-escalation of tensions, taking into account the legitimate security interests of all countries and aimed towards securing long-term peace and stability in the region and beyond. We are convinced that this issue can only be resolved through diplomatic dialogue.
Everyone was eagerly waiting for Ambassador Tirumurthy's speech. He was the first non-NATO member to speak. Would he side with Russia or with the US? As it turned out, neither. India called for talks and restraint. But how much longer can this policy work? Until now, there was only a threat of war. So talks and restraint was fine. But now the invasion is happening. Russia is sending soldiers into what is technically Ukrainian land. So clearly talks have failed. And Indian policymakers will have a major choice to make. Do you remain neutral? Or do you reevaluate your ties with Russia? I know it sounds impossible. India-Russia relations go back decades. Defense, space exploration, nuclear energy. This is a strategic partnership par excellence. Having said that, India has three responsibilities to remember. A, it is a growing global power. B, it is the world's largest democracy. And C, it has separatists and border disputes of its own. This conflict may be happening in Ukraine, but the principles are universal. Sovereignty and territorial integrity are non-negotiable. India, of all countries, would know that. If you want to lead the world, you will have to take risks. Maybe find new partners, let go of some old ones, or defend principles at the cost of your friends. Let me quote what India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar said in 2020. These are his words. Either you're in the game or you're not in the game. The era of great caution and greater dependence on multilateralism is behind us. We need to take risks. Without taking risks, you cannot get ahead. And that's what Ukraine is, a risk. If India criticizes Russia, it may lose a strategic partner. So New Delhi have to make a gamble. Either hope the relationship will survive such criticism or bet on gaining new friends. And both scenarios have their own benefits. We keep talking about the India-Russia defense deals. Well, those deals are not a one-way street. If Russia is supplying weapons, India is paying for them. And with all these new sanctions, Putin is going to need that Indian money even more. Secondly, it's not like Russia is not exploring new alliances. You know who's visiting Russia tomorrow? Putin is welcoming Imran Khan to Moscow. Reports say the Russian president may visit Pakistan this year. So both sides are looking at options, to be fair. India with Western democracies and Russia with China and Pakistan. The question is, what does India prioritize? Principles or partnerships? How does it balance national interest with international responsibility? And just to be clear, this does not mean that India should embrace the NATO or blindly follow the United States. It means India will take decisions based on what is right and wrong. And to do that, you need strategic autonomy. You need your own defense equipment, your own fighter jets, a self-sufficient economy. And that's the only way you can achieve strategic autonomy. To be fair, India is moving in that direction. More and more defense manufacturing is happening in India. Indian firms are being encouraged. But this is not going to happen overnight. Import substitution is a long and drawn-out process, but India will have to stick to this path because the alternative is a confused foreign policy. And while we track the developments in Ukraine, here's one story that we've been bringing you since day one. What is happening in Canada? The trucker siege has finally ended. The blockade has been cleared out. The police have regained control. Ottawa has returned to normalcy. But despite all of this, a state of emergency still persists in the country. Why is that? If the blockade is over, why isn't the emergency over? Because the Canadian Prime Minister says he needs emergency powers to maintain public order. His critics say this is an overreach, that Justin Trudeau is abusing his power. A fierce debate has kicked off. Our next report has all the details.
Canada's trucker siege has ended. The last big rigs have been towed out. The sound of blaring horns is gone. Ottawa's streets are back to normalcy. For the first time in weeks, there's only snow and silence in the country's capital, as the authorities breathe a sigh of relief.
We promised that we would return our city to a state of normalcy. With every hour, we are getting closer to that goal. City crews are clearing and plowing the affected areas. As I said, at this time, checkpoints remain throughout the city. We ask residents to respect these checkpoints and the officers who are working there.
The blockade is mostly over. The police have regained control. But despite this, a state of emergency persists. Why? Because the Prime Minister of Canada says he still needs emergency powers to stop any future anti-government protests.
But even though the blockades are lifted across border openings right now, even though things seem to be resolving very well in Ottawa, this state of emergency is not over. There continues to be real concerns about the coming days, but we will continue to evaluate every single day whether or not it is time and we are able to lift this state of emergency.
The decision may have been taken by Trudeau, but it also has the backing of Canada's Parliament. On Monday, it approved the Emergencies Act by a swift vote of 185 to 151. This is the second time the Canadian government has invoked the Emergencies Act. The last time it was invoked, Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was in power. This act grants the government broader powers to rein in future threats. The government can now stop public gatherings, restrict the use of public property for protests, and control the movement of protesters. Trudeau says these powers are important to maintain public order. His critics say he is abusing his power. They're calling the emergency unnecessary and unconstitutional. Interim Conservative leader Candice Bergen has described Trudeau's move as an overreach. She also sought the criteria for this emergency to be declared. Conservative MP Dean Allison has described the decision as an authoritarian military-style measure. And Green Party member Mike Morris says invoking the act is an inappropriate response to failure in policing. It most certainly is. Canada has faced terror attacks, national movements, economic collapses, and a pandemic. All these situations were dealt with using existing laws, using the normal democratic processes. But the truckers' protest, which has largely been peaceful, is being subjected to the strictest law in the country, the Emergencies Act. Not only does this reveal the current government's failures to handle the protests, but it also sets the wrong precedent. It will give future governments in Canada an opportunity to invoke such powers for political reasons. As for Justin Trudeau, the poster boy of liberal politics is proving to be an authoritarian. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
With that, it's a wrap on this show. But remember, we'll keep tracking the Ukraine story for you. We're leaving you with Gravitas images. Thanks for watching.
Ist ja ganz verlangt,